50 years ago, the Guggenheim Museum, designed by Lloyd Wright, opened in New York City. The Guggenheim Museum was an aggressive act. Lloyd Wright hated cities. His spiraling museum was, in a way, an attack against the Manhattan street grid. The interior of the museum as well has its own kinds of rigidity. Wright likened it to the spiral of life, but it also resembled, in its own way, the spiraling ramps of a parking garage. Over the years, Wright's building has become an artwork as important as many of the works that have hung on its walls. In my mind, the best shows at the Guggenheim tend to be sculpture shows or architectural installations. The Frank Gehry show, for example, transformed the spiraling ramps into a big workshop, and the messiness of Gehry's models played off the sleekness of the ramps in a beautiful way. The Richard Prince show, with the body of a car lodged in a block at the center of the rotunda, touching on themes of the open road and freedom, also acted as a beautiful counterpoint to the fluidity of the ramps. I think it becomes more difficult when you're trying to break away from a conventional, straightforward narrative. The David Smith show, for example, where the sculptures had room to breathe, worked beautifully in that it was a very straightforward narrative sequence as you wound your way up the ramps. But in something like the Spanish show, where you had El Grecos and Picassos, and one painting lined up next to the other, and you couldn't break out of that narrative, you couldn't set up views through doorways from one room to another, then the building becomes somewhat rigid. Now the museum is celebrating its 50th anniversary with an exhibit of Wright's work. Many critics still see his building as unsympathetic to art, too rigid, a difficult place to install art.
Well, this leg is not touched at all, so...
It was designed, of course, to be a smooth surface, but over time, and just being the nature of the building, there's always a little bit of flux, so nothing's perfect here.
Wright died 6 months before the museum opened. Over the last 50 years, it's put on nearly 500 shows and undergone 2 rounds of renovation.
In the case of the Guggenheim, the idea was to experience art in a completely different way, and that art is a social experience.
People come together in this space, and then they can see each other in this space as a group. There's a constant relationship between your fellow visitors you see on the ground, you see them through the ramps, you see them across the ramps.
At 50, the Guggenheim remains a radical model for an art museum. Its rotunda continues to inspire generations of architects.
I think the building probably functions on both the art and architecture level. It's a great piece of architecture, and it's the biggest object in our collection, and we're very happy with that.
For the New York Times, this is Nicolai Ouroussoff.